Our South African motorists face further petrol price hikes in the coming months, with an increase of over R2 possibly coming into effect in April. Of course, many have been weighing in on what the situation will mean, particularly for the pockets and the cost of living for many South Africans. Former Gauteng Premier Mbazima Shilowa is joining us to weigh in on this issue. Of course, it's not just motorists that are going to be affected by these steep increases in the price of petrol. Literally anybody who needs to get around, who is a citizen of this country, who needs to buy food, is going to feel it.
Indeed, this thing of the increase in oil prices and therefore our own oil prices here is going to impact on everybody. And I think people tend to look at it simply in terms of the increase at the pump, but tend to ignore that immediately that has happened, there's increase in toll gates, there's increase in bus, rail, and taxi fares, and that also shops also increase their own food prices. So even if you don't have a car, even if you are a pensioner, even if you are unemployed, this thing get into you. That's why it's my view that in addition to looking at what government can do in the short term to sort out the issue of the petrol prices, they must also put at the center in NEDLEC, at least with labor, civil society and others and employers, the whole issue of a viable public transport system.
Of course, the difficulty there is that we have watched the public transport system in this country even move from the basic that was there to becoming completely, decimated, especially if we take into account what has happened to rail. The multiple projects that government seems to have embarked on, and I can think here of the various launches of Rea Vaya in different parts of the country, that in and of itself has not played the kind of role that it was meant to. Why do you think it has been that public transport, just as an imperative, that government has failed so dismally on it?
I think maybe because in how we deploy our ministers, in how we deploy the PRASA board, we have really not paid attention to its importance in moving people from point A to point B. Secondly, we have not worked enough to ensure the integration of rail, bus, and taxis as well. But I would also argue that one of the things that makes it more difficult is also that PRASA is managing metro rail, when in fact in other countries, metro rail is managed at a provincial level, where you can have a transport authority that links with the various metros, which is really where this system is concerned. Secondly, we need to look at how can we, because infrastructure is there, Katie. You can look at the infrastructure, even if you leave aside Rea Vaya, which we need, but even just the rail, there is enough trains. It's just a question of ensuring that there is security, that railway lines are not removed, and overhead lines and all of that. So it is possible with money, with the will, and with integration to change the situation around.
Of course, some of those who look at the state of affairs often suggest that the reason why we don't see a greater move, at least to improve public transport, is that there are so many people who are benefiting from the private public transport system, and that is a status quo that it seems government does not want to shake fundamentally.
Well, I know that there will be some people, individuals, maybe one or two politicians here and there, and or police that also own taxis. But I don't think that is really the main reason. I think it's just simply that we have not paid enough attention to it. I mean, if you look at the ANC's own election manifesto, it speaks of public transport. The president himself was stuck on a train from Soshanguve for more than an hour in between Pretoria and Soshanguve, you know. So it's not that they don't know what it's about. And I'm convinced that it's not about that people benefit. I think it's simply that the trade unions have not placed this matter at the center of social and economic development, that employers themselves who see loss of production with workers arriving late and so forth have not made this thing a priority. The same with broad communities, most of whom are unemployed. They need to rely on train and public transport to go and look for work, which is why I think a movement for public transport is a necessity in our country if we are going to get this thing right.
Of course, you don't just stop there. You also question the efficiency of the current Transport Minister, Fikile Mbalula.
Yes, no, I do. I mean, I question really his efficiency, his commitment, the attention he pays. But it's also important to look at the fact that really it has been the same from when there was Jeff. It's only that at least transport was still moving a bit. You have had Maswanganyi and so forth, you know. So I think until the ANC looks at this thing and say, it is not just enough to put a minister. We need to be clear that what is it that we want to achieve. But I argue that until the trade unions and business make this a central issue, we're not going to move anywhere, even if, of course, we get a new minister. Also, funding has been reduced for public transport, whether it is the subsidies for buses, the lack of subsidies for taxis, but also Metro Rail itself, there's no funding. I mean, you have to just go and look at the budget that was tabled when Tito was there. Because we needed some money, 10 billion, for SAA, we reduced money from PRASA, among other things, and yet we speak about the need for public transport.
When you talk about the role of trade unions being central to, developing some form of grassroots-led movement that is going to ensure that this is a priority, does it speak to unions that have become out of touch with their constituencies? Because more and more, the evidence is clear in terms of what it is that people who are employed are spending their salaries on. And unfortunately, that cost for transport, keeps increasing over the years. And we know that the lower that one earns, the more of the income it takes away.
I think that our trade unions across the board have placed at the center for now the happenings inside the ANC, particularly COSATU. They're more concerned about who is going to be the president of the ANC and therefore the president of the country, more concerned about the unity of COSATU, of the alliance, rather than the concerns of their own members. You know, the middle class in many countries across the world use trains, they use buses to get to work. Here, as soon as you move to the middle class, you've got to buy a car in order to be able to move from point A to point B, which means at the end of the month, you are left with very little, which is why you find that many of us live in debt, because it's both in terms of transport and food, not to mention ordinary workers from the factories who years back could hop into a train cheaper and move to the place. Now they've got to rely on taxis, which are very expensive. So they too live with funds from the Mashonisas.
What are the consequences of things not changing, so the situation remaining as is?
I think at some point we're going to have a social strife, similar to what we saw in KZN and Gauteng. I know that it may have been related to what was happening with regard to the former president of the ANC, people using that, and or social issues. But I think over time, once people can't get food because it's just expensive, Once they realize that the 350 is not going to help them, one of the things it's going to do is to cause that social strife. But what I'm more afraid of is that the next bargaining rounds for wages, the whole issue of transport allowance is going to be placed on the table by the trade unions. Also, the whole issue of above inflation increases will be placed on the table because people will say, well, we now need money to be able to buy more food and to be able to afford transport. And it's something which we need to avoid at all costs.
Former Gauteng Premier Mbazima Shilowa, let me thank you for your time tonight.
Really will.